Welcome to our deep dive today. We're tackling a really fascinating and, let's be honest, often challenging topic, transracial identity.
It really is. And it's not just some academic debate anymore, is it? It's
Yes.
popping up everywhere.
Exactly. Online forums, YouTube discussions, academic papers, even Wikipedia entries. We've looked at a whole stack of your sources.
hmm
And today, our mission is really to unpack what transracialism means, how it links to race and gender, the history, the ethics, all of it.
Trying to pull out the key insights, right, to help
Yeah.
you get properly informed on what is a very complex subject.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Before we even get to transracial identity, we probably need to get a handle on race itself. And the sources show well, it's not straightforward.
No, it really isn't. What's striking is just how much our understanding of race has shifted over time.
How so?
Well, historically, there was this very rigid idea of race as a fixed biological thing. You had early classifications like Linnaeus back in the 1700s,
Right.
and they often bundled physical traits with, frankly, racist ideas to justify hierarchies.
And things like polygenism, too. The idea of different origins.
Exactly. That was used to justify horrific things like
Mm.
slavery. It was a really problematic foundation.
So how has modern science changed that view? Because that historical perspective sounds pretty debunked now.
Oh, completely. The scientific consensus today is that race is primarily a social construct.
Meaning?
Well, look at the Human Genome Project, for instance. It found there's actually more genetic variation within the groups we call races than between them.
That's counterintuitive for a lot of people, I think.
It can be. Think about skin color. It shows what scientists call clinal variation. It changes gradually
Yeah.
across geography, like a smooth gradient.
Not like neat boxes.
Precisely, not distinct steps. And then you have non-concordant variation. Different traits, say skin color versus blood type, they don't change together across populations. There's no single race gene package.
Okay, that makes sense biologically. But if it's not this strict biological fact, why does race still feel so real? Why does it have such a huge impact on people's lives, on society?
That's the absolute crucial point, isn't it? Even as a social construct, race has very objective, very real-world consequences.
Like what?
We see it everywhere.
Yeah.
In health disparities, in the justice system. Even think about forensic science. When a scientist assigns a race to skeletal remains,
Yeah.
that's less about revealing a biological truth and more a prediction of how society would have categorized that person based on appearance.
So it reflects the social reality, the way society treats people based on these categories.
Exactly. It's about how society perceives and treats individuals
Mhm.
based on those constructed categories. It has tangible effects.
And how does this differ from ethnicity? Because that often feels, I don't know, more personal, maybe?
Yeah, that's a good distinction to make. Ethnicity often involves a sense of shared roots, ancestry, language, customs, a common heritage. Think ancient Greeks or Persians.
What?
Now, ethnicity can be inherited and socially constructed too, but race tends to get tied more visibly to physical traits. And historically, it's been heavily linked to power dynamics and inequality.
Right. So with that foundation, let's pivot to transracial identity. The basic definition from the sources is identifying with a race different from the one assigned at birth. But what's driving that? What do the sources say about the internal experience?
Well, what's really interesting is the sheer diversity of motivations. It's not just one thing.
Mm-hmm.
It can come from a really deep emotional or psychological connection to another culture. Sometimes it's about seeking belonging or maybe even wanting to escape stereotypes tied to one's assigned race.
Are there examples of that in the sources?
Yeah, some quite personal ones. There was a Reddit user mentioned who felt bullied for their appearance and found acceptance by adopting a Japanese aesthetic.
Okay.
And another story involved a Black woman in Europe feeling pressured by local beauty standards who actually considered changing her appearance to look more Japanese.
Mm-hmm.
It points to these complex internal pressures.
So it definitely pushes back against the idea that it's just, playing dress up, as some critics might frame it. It sounds like a genuine internal pull for some.
That seems to be the case for many, yes. A profound desire to align their internal sense of self with how they present externally.
And this can involve physical changes.
Sometimes, yes. The sources mention people like Ollie London, who had surgeries aiming to look like a K-pop star, or Martina Big, a white German model who identifies as Black and underwent pretty extreme body modifications.
Wow.
But for others, it's more about deep cultural immersion, learning the language, adopting customs.
Right.
And this ties into a concept some sources brought up called morphological freedom.
Morphological freedom.
Yeah, basically the idea that individuals should have the right to modify their bodies, potentially including racial features, as long as it doesn't harm others. It's an ethical argument that comes up.
Okay, now this is where things often get really contentious, isn't it? The comparison between transracialism and transgender identity. It comes up again and again in the sources.
It does. It's a central point of debate.
And the question often posed is, if society increasingly accepts transgender identity, why not transracial identity?
That's the core of the argument from similarity, as some sources call it. The logic being, if we accept that transgender people genuinely are the gender they identify as, then perhaps we should extend that same acceptance to transracial identities. Both seem to involve this desire to align an internal sense of self with an external reality.
But I imagine many people listening immediately think of the differences, and the sources do highlight criticisms and key distinctions, don't they? It's not presented as a simple one-to-one thing.
Not at all. And this is where we get into some really critical points.
Yeah.
While gender identity is increasingly understood as this internal, deeply felt sense of self, and there's growing science suggesting biological links, rooted in the brain,
Right.
the biological basis for race, as we just discussed, is much, much weaker. It's primarily social.
Okay, so that's one major difference. What else?
A really key distinction critics emphasize is the intergenerational nature of racial oppression.
Okay, explain that.
They argue that the historical trauma and the systemic disadvantages tied to race, think about the legacy of slavery or the residential schools for Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah, terrible histories.
That kind of collective inherited experience is passed down through generations in a way that's fundamentally different from the experience of gender identity.
And that difference then fuels concerns about things like cultural appropriation and privilege.
Directly, yes.
Yeah.
Critics argue that when someone, particularly someone from a dominant group, adopts elements of another racial group's culture without fully understanding or respecting its history and meaning.
It can feel like reducing it to a costume.
Exactly, like it's just a costume, trivializing the lived experiences, the struggles, the resilience of that group. It can also touch on issues like colorism.
The Rachel Dolezal case comes to mind here, which was huge.
Absolutely. A white woman presenting as black, leading an NAACP chapter that sparked enormous controversy. Many saw it as a modern form of blackface, essentially, and definitely cultural appropriation. It raised really sharp questions about authenticity, who gets to define identity, and where the limits are. Shaun King faced similar scrutiny, too.
So the argument often is then that a white person identifying as, say, black is exercising a form of white privilege because they can potentially adopt the identity without having lived through the historical oppression associated with it.
That's a central concern you see raised repeatedly in the sources, yes. Yeah. The perceived ability to sort of try on an identity without carrying its historical weight, its systemic disadvantages. Although, interestingly, some sources present a counter-argument, too.
Which is?
That not transitioning, if you're white but identify otherwise, could also be seen as maintaining white privilege by continuing to benefit from the system you were born into.
That's a complex angle.
It is. But overall, the sense you get from the sources is that race is often seen as a more closely policed category than gender because of its incredibly deep ties to civil rights history, to specific historical struggles and legislation. That leads to stronger societal resistance, generally, against the idea of self-identification across racial lines.
Okay, so zooming out a bit, what does all this mean for society more broadly? This whole deep dive seems to point towards identities becoming more unsettled.
That's a good way to put it. If you connect the dots, you definitely see racial categories themselves becoming less rigid, less fixed.
How so?
Well, look at the U.S. Census. It moved away from really strict classifications, like the old one-drop rule, to allowing people to identify with multiple races starting back in 2000. That signals a kind of declining authority of ancestry, perhaps. Identity seems to be shifting more towards personal feeling, individual choice.
Are there academic ways of thinking about this shift?
Yeah. The sources mention a few frameworks, things like transitive migration, how identity shifts when people move cultures, or transitive between, thinking about multiracial identities that embrace being between categories, and even transitive beyond, people who might reject racial categories altogether. It helps map this fluidity.
And then there's technology. Could that push this unsettling even further?
Oh, potentially in huge ways. That's something the sources really speculate about. Think about technologies like genome editing or nanotechnology.
Right, CRISPR and things like that.
Exactly. If those could, theoretically, allow people to physically change traits we associate with race. Well, that opens a massive ethical can of worms, doesn't it?
It really does. Would that make transracialism more accepted, or would it just create new divides?
Unknowable questions right now.
Mm.
And then you've got AI and virtual reality, too. The possibility of having digital avatars that reflect any race you choose, that further blurs the lines between our physical selves and our, maybe, chosen virtual identities.
It's all incredibly complex and sometimes uncomfortable to discuss, but it feels like approaching it with empathy is key.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Critical thinking, trying to stay open-minded, communicating respectfully,
Hmm.
it's all essential. And just to be clear, our role here is to report impartially on what's in the sources.
Right.
We aren't endorsing any specific viewpoint, just trying to convey the ideas accurately.
And part of that accurate reporting means acknowledging that these discussions about shifting identities can sometimes trigger some really extreme and frankly dangerous reactions and ideologies.
That is a really vital point that came up in the materials, yes. It's crucial to be aware of and report on the existence of dangerous, completely unfounded conspiracy theories like white genocide or the Great Replacement.
These are baseless theories claiming white populations are being deliberately eliminated.
Yes, and they're deeply racist narratives.
Yeah.
Worse still, they've been directly linked to horrific real-world violence. You look at the 2022 Buffalo shooting, the 2011 Norway attacks.
Mm.
These aren't just abstract ideas.
Mhm.
And the sources point out, while it's a demographic fact that people identified as white are a statistical global minority, about 11% of the world population,
Yeah.
that demographic fact absolutely does not imply any kind of social vulnerability or threat of subjugation. Twisting it that way is a core tactic of white supremacist ideology.
And where the sources suggest this kind of tribalism or racism comes from.
Often it seems to stem from personal insecurities that get projected outwards.
Yeah.
And sadly, social media echo chambers can just amplify these fears and hatreds. It's a disturbing aspect connected to these identity debates.
Wow. Okay. We have definitely covered a huge amount of ground today. I mean, from dissecting race itself as a social construct to digging into the complexities of transracial identity, the controversial parallels with transgenderism, how society is reacting, and then these sort of mind-bending future tech possibilities. It's clear there are just no easy answers here.
No, there really aren't. It's been a
Wow.
fascinating exploration, though. It just reinforces how race is so much more
Yeah.
than some simple fixed biological category. It's this whole spectrum of experience, isn't it? Influenced by ancestry, sure, but also profoundly shaped by individual choice, by how society sees us, by power dynamics. It's incredibly layered.
Absolutely. So as you, our listeners, continue to think through all these complex layers, we want to leave you with one final, pretty provocative question to chew on, drawn from that discussion about technology. If genome editing tech advanced to the point where individuals could safely and completely change their physical racial features, would that ultimately lead us towards a more just and equitable society? Or could it, paradoxically, end up creating entirely new forms of division and inequality? Something to think about.